This is lecture number 8 in the series ABCs of Communism. Today our subject is the Second World War. Now the Second World War for us, that is for Bolshevism, begins in Spain. And what we need to do is to take a quick look at what we confronted in Spain as the Civil War there kicked off in 1936. Now you say, well, I thought the Second World War began in 1939. Well, it did for England and Germany, but not for us. It kicked off for us in 1936, which was far earlier than we were prepared to go to war with Germany, but we were confronted with a situation which required the intervention of the Soviet Union. How did we get into that situation? We'll take a look at Spanish history first of all. After the Spanish conquest of the New World, by which I mean after the Spanish conquest of New Spain, that is Mexico, which was done by a bunch of independent adventurers working on their own initiative, the Spanish crown finally got involved in the entire matter, and they had two concerns. First of all, they wanted to retain the feudal structure they had back home. And they definitely did not want to have inside Spanish frontiers this new mercantile bourgeois class which was growing up in what we today call Germany and in the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and in northern France and England. Why didn't they want that? Well, on the one hand, they appreciated the technological advances which were occurring there. On the other, they saw something that was terribly frightening to them, and that is that these bourgeois elements quickly had become the financiers of all of the local nobility in these particular areas, and had effectively brought the feudal order under the control of this burgeoning bourgeois capitalist order, and that they did not want in Spain. So what they had done in Spain, especially after the first half of the 1500s, was to keep capitalism to the degree that they could outside of their frontiers. Now, that had meant a variety of things, but among other things, it meant that if you wanted to be a young man developing some kind of factory, you had best go to another part of the world to do it. Now, many of them went to the New World, and many of them went to the Old World in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines have been important to us before, as we've discussed. But the system that the Spanish had set up for 400 years had worked pretty well. That is, say, from 1518 to roughly 1921, the Spanish monarchy had been able to isolate these bourgeois forces from overthrowing their own internal feudal structure, which was basically what they wanted to retain at home was a situation where you have noblemen and women with a castle sitting on top of a group of very poor peasants who you rule over, and they do pretty much what you tell them to do, and that's the social system that had existed in Spain now, that is by the early 1900s, for about 400 years. Well, what changed all of that? What changed it, what brought Spain into the modern world, was when the United States conquered the Philippines, that is when it defeated the Spanish Navy and took over the Philippines, because immediately thereafter the Spanish capitalists who were there and had been doing well and made a lot of money and established themselves over the centuries were forced to leave. Their place was being taken by North American businessmen who were taking advantage of the fact that their troops occupied that country, and there was no longer a place there for this old Spanish capitalist class, so they returned to Spain. Now this was very upsetting to Spanish rulers, but there wasn't very much they could do about it. These were, after all, Spaniards. They were of the same racial variety as they were. They came back to Spain with all of their technology and their ideas about what they wanted to have in the terms of what they considered to be a modern government and modern social institutions, and they came back with a lot of money. So many Spanish feudalists welcomed that, because these guys were always broke, and traditionally they had borrowed money from each other, or they would borrow money from the leader of their gang, the king or the queen of that particular area. But now there was the opportunity for many of these families to get out of poverty if their daughters happened to marry one of these capitalists that was coming back from Manila. So they melded quite quickly into the situation, but as they did in Spain, they doomed that old order. So by 1921, you had a situation where these are men who came back with not being willing to wait at all for modern property concepts or modern concepts of government to solve the internal problems they might have among themselves, and they had been putting all kinds of pressure on the government to make these kinds of changes. Well, what we're going to do here is see that the idea of we'll take capitalism our way, thank you, and go away was no longer going to work. Now, their idea of the way they would have education established in Spain for 400 years had been to gradually reduce the number of universities, so that the early start the Spaniards had taken in terms of universities and higher education came to a grinding halt. 60 universities were reduced to 15 over the period of a couple of centuries. And there was no need for public education because in the feudal order there was no real reason for these farmers and peasant farmers to know how to read or write or do anything. Their orders were given to them by their superiors. So at any rate, what happened was a radical change within the social structure of the Spanish ruling class itself. Other thing that happened was that there were radical new steps being taken in the countryside on the part of revolutionary forces. Now, the most important one initially was the anarchist movement, which, as you'll recall, had a couple of bases in Western Europe. One was in northern Italy, the other was in Spain, and this anarchist movement had continued to grow even after Karl Marx had sent the First International to Philadelphia to be dissolved, so to keep it out of the hands of anarchists who were capable of sending large delegations to First International meetings and had been doing so. In that way, he had kept the First International out of the hands of the anarchists, but now in Spain they have gotten to be quite big, and they have set up unions in the factories in Barcelona and Valencia, places like that, as well as on the land which was their traditional area of support. The lay of the land was that Spanish anarchist leaders built a following among the industrial proletariat, and they supplemented that with the increasing growth of their organization among peasants, what they called the National Work Confederation, because in our theory, it's not a workers' confederation, but it was a confederation of independent producers who would work together collectively and share the products of their labor among themselves. Marxism had adherents in Spain, but not the way it had in Russia, for example, before the revolution. There were relatively few of them. In the 1917 revolution, the Bolsheviks had sent agents to Spain, and they had put the Communist Party of Spain into existence, and it had about 10,000 members by the beginning of 1918, but that's very small, 200,000 members by 1919. But at the same time, the CNT, the anarchist union, had over 700,000 members, and so you can see there was a tremendous difference in the size of these organizations. So what we had here was a completely different kind of situation within Spain than we'd had in Russia. Now, in 1931, the Spanish monarchy finally gave in to the demands of its own ruling class, and the king abdicated. The consequence of that was that there was a radical division within the ruling class in Spain itself between those who wanted to restore the old order and those who wanted to support the new order. And that led inevitably to civil war for two reasons. First of all, the the left, that is the communists who were getting bigger by the year because of the importance of the Soviet Union, and the anarchists who were always big and didn't get any less big during these years, were pushing the government to enact radical new reforms that were far too radical for the right wing of the ruling class of Spain. So what happened? Well, what happened was that there was a billionaire in Spain named Juan March, and he took the lead in terms of organizing a fascist revolt. And he was, in other words, like Big-Eared Du in Shanghai, or Meyer Lansky in the United States, a gang leader who had the ability to back up what he wanted to do. So what he wanted to do was to overthrow this Republican government, which he considered to be far too left for him, and to replace it with a fascist regime similar to what we had in Germany or Italy. To do that, he decided to use a general named Francisco Franco, who had been on the far right of army politics. Franco was actually almost a dwarf. He was so short. He had been exiled by the Republican government to being commander of a garrison out on the Canary Islands, and there he was sitting waiting for something to happen. What happened was that Juan March sent an airplane from London to pick him up and bring him back to North Africa. Now, when he got to North Africa, he began putting together a military revolt against the government in Madrid, and he did that relatively successfully. So that by the summer of 1936, they were ready to pull the trigger and establish that revolt. The Russians were watching all of this, and of course they had a pretty good intelligence service by now that was operating in Spain, and their European service was excellent. They had a really good insight into what the British ruling class was doing, and from Stalin's perspective, it was the British ruling class which was the most dangerous, because they were the ones that were behind the idea of a London-Berlin-Rome axis, and they were the ones that were pulling all the strings that they could to bring that about. At the same time, he realized that there were fascist elements in Spain who were planning on a fascist army officers' revolt, and he had to anticipate that he would have to do something about that. So what did he do? Well, the first thing he did was to bring Alexander Orlov back from England and gave him a new assignment, which was to take command of Soviet secret operations in Spain. So Orlov went to Spain and he visited the spots that Stalin told him he needed information about. He left behind working cadre and radio contact with Moscow Center so that they could keep him informed as to how things were developing. And then he came back to Moscow and he reported to Stalin at the end of August of 1936 on what was going on there. So what was going on is that in July, General Franco had called for a revolt, as had another general who was based out of Portugal. The other general died on takeoff when his airplane left this Lisbon airstrip and failed to clear the ground and get up into the air, and so that was the end of him. What that left behind was Franco and his forces out in North Africa. At the time, of course, there was some discussion as to whether this was really an accident that had happened to the general leaving Portugal or not. With this bunch, it's hard to tell because they're frequently killing each other. So, but at any rate, Juan March now has the job of putting Franco out of North Africa into Spain proper. And to do that, he has made some arrangements with the Italians for aircraft and ships to lift some of Franco's men into Spain, close to the Spanish city of Badajoz, but not enough. Francisco Franco on his own has made some independent contacts with the Hitlerites, and the Germans have agreed to help him. They say on his own. However, von March had all of these connections in Berlin too, so it's hard for me to imagine that he wasn't involved in that also. But the important thing was that the Germans sent ships and planes to protect, to move the bulk of Franco's forces onto the Spanish mainland and to protect him from government attack. So they made many trips by air, bringing these guys over, airplane by airplane and also by ship, until they had a better part of Franco's North African army in Spain. They attacked the city of Badajoz, conducted what was called a massacre there, and then proceeded toward Madrid. Now, at this particular time, Stalin has decided to intervene, but the situation there is very tricky. He doesn't want to get caught in the trap that the British and French would like him to get caught in, which is sending the Red Army and Red Navy officially there under flag. So what he tells Orlov is, what we're going to do is intervene, all right, and the first troops that get there will be Russian volunteers, but we need to send international communist volunteers from around the world so that this can be a broad anti-fascist war that's being conducted in Spain. So the Comintern immediately sets about implementing this policy, and the word goes out from everywhere. The headquarters for the Comintern operations is in Paris, and one of the men that's in charge of it is the Yugoslav Tito, who will become famous after World War II for establishing the communist government in Yugoslavia. But at any rate, at this time, he's working for the Comintern out of Paris, and his job is to get these guys from all of these different countries, because all of a sudden you have volunteers coming from every country in Europe and from North America. The North Americans themselves, for the first time that North American communists have gotten involved in a war of this nature, and they volunteer in large numbers, and so do women from the United States. About 80 women from the United States join this international brigade as nurses and truck drivers and various kinds of non-combatants. But and they're also integrated, so there's at least one black woman among these women come in there, which makes it the first U.S. integrated army, both racially and sexually. So at any rate, the volunteers are coming from all over the world, and they're being channeled into Spain, where they're being received by Russian army officers who are volunteers there. Of course, they've been assigned by Stalin and Orlov to do this job. So Alexander Orlov emerges at this time in a new capacity. Until this time, he's been in charge of industrial espionage in Western Europe, and especially political espionage in Great Britain, where he indirectly controlled or set up Philby, McLean, Burgess, Karen Cross, and the other one. So now he's back. Interestingly enough, he's going to be back with his #1 prime British pupil, Kim Philby, who is going to show up in Spain now as on his job, which is to establish contact with the Franco forces, and his job is to build his own cover for later penetration into British MI6. But to build that cover, they need to give him some good fascist credentials, and they do that by getting him a job with one British newspaper, Evening Standard, later, a few months later for the London Times. So he's there from the very beginning of this thing in late 1936, early 1937, and this time, though, as a correspondent attached to the fascist side of the Civil War. At any rate, see, these are some of the things that are happening behind the scenes. Now, Stalin sends a large number of tanks and planes, heavy weapons, bullets, rifles, and so on ships to the Republican ports for the Republican Army. And the Nazis are afraid to attack those ships, because, as are the Italians, because if they were to attack them, then they would then have to confront the possibility of war with the Soviet Union, and they're not at all sure they're up to that yet, which was a wise decision on their part, because as they're about to find out in Spain, they're not up to it. Now, in one of the reasons that we like to point to Spain as the beginning of this war is not just the politics, which puts the Soviet Union at war with world fascism, but the mechanics of it, because Soviet aircraft and tanks, which are the most numerous and the best in the world at this particular time, have yet to be tested in combat. So at the end of 1936, they begin to get their first testing in that way. And from that time forward, the specifications that Orlov gets from the way those tanks and planes performed and what his suggestions are for improving the performance of those planes and tanks are sent directly back to Stalin, who oversees the corrections in the factories of both the airplanes and the tanks to be sure that all of these changes that Orlov is recommending based on combat action are being carried out. So that in itself is a very important factor. Now, as 1937 progresses, the fascists get stopped in the early part outside of Madrid. At this time, they have 4 columns moving against Madrid from 4 different directions. Then they are supplemented by 150,000 Italian troops, that is the Spanish fascist troops, 20,000 Portuguese troops from the fascist regime of Dr. Salazar in Portugal, and they are supplemented by German and Italian planes and tanks. So stopping them is not an easy matter, and yet they are stopped. How did that happen? Well, primarily it happened because of the action of these international brigades, which are now there and on the front line along with Spanish regular army units. And these are men who are there because they want to be there. They went through all kinds of hardships on their own to get there before the official contingents were organized in their countries and got them there. So these are fanatical fighters who will do what Che Guevara said a spiritually superior fighter has to do, and that is put himself in a position from which he can win, regardless of the danger to himself. So the international brigades have stiffened the ranks of the Spanish army, and they have led it in a counteroffensive. They have destroyed Mussolini's 150,000 man army virtually by themselves, and of course they've thrown the Spanish fascists into retreat. It's at this time that the term fifth column comes up, because Franco was bragging to the press that he had a fifth column inside Madrid that was going to rise up and join the 4 attacking columns as they got closer. Well, that turned out not to materialize, at least not at that time. A couple of years later it might materialize, but by that time the battlefront situation had changed radically. So what it did do was to create an atmosphere of fear among the left that this kind of secret underground fascist organization could be being created. Something like happened in the Ukraine here recently. So that meant that there had to be some kind of stringent search at home for the emergence of a fifth column of fascists that would try and subvert what were called the democratic powers of Europe, meaning France and England. But of course, Stalin and the communists took it seriously too, and they began to look within their own frontiers for the dangers of fifth columnists. All right, now, in terms of the technological status of Spain during this war, one of the things that is interesting for you to realize is that Spain did not have the mass production facilities because of this history of not encouraging capitalist development within Spanish frontiers, but it did have the scientific and technological foundation from which these things could be built. And an example is that the best airplane engine of the entire Second World War was built first in the Spanish steel auto complex called Hispano-Suiza. And that was the production of that prototype couldn't be done in Spain, but it switched immediately to England and Spain and France right after the World War began. And what it does show us is that even though Spanish capital did not have the manufacturing capability, it had the scientific and technological capability to develop capitalism if it wanted to. And 30 years later, of course, that is exactly what had happened. Now, as I say, it was Juan March who financed this entire thing and got Franco off and running. 1935, we have the Comintern 7th Congress that was held in Moscow. Now, at that time, George Dimitrov was a Bulgarian who had been elected president of the Comintern. He'd come to some international attention because he'd been arrested in Germany and charged with being one of those who had burned down the Reichstag, which everybody knew by this time that Hitler burned down the Reichstag on his own and just liked to have somebody to blame it on, which happened to be, as usual, the Jews and the communists. So, at any rate, Dimitrov had gotten quite a bit of attention because he'd stood up to the Nazis in Germany and denounced them publicly. So he was that kind of guy. Problem was, as Stalin was finding out, is that he was a little dense. And I go over this on page 348, sub-detail. I'll let the rest of you, if you're interested, you can go to that page and take in your textbook and take a look at it. But the important thing is, Molotov explained to Stalin that he had recommended Dimitrov to him because Dimitrov was highly respected by the comrades and he was well liked. He would spend hours and hours at his desk answering letters from members of the Communist parties and the parties themselves, and he took his job very seriously in that respect. So, one way or the other, they got used to that particular idea. Now, something else that had happened in the early part of 1936 is that King George the Fifth in England had died on January 20th, 1936. Now, the British were planning on inviting about 40,000 people to the coronation of the next king, and that was going to take over a year before it was actually to come to pass. But in the meantime, the next king came up, and this was the one who, David, who had been Prince of Wales, I guess is what he was, became the new king. He took the name Edward VIII. Well, this was bad news for Stalin because all the people that could have taken the throne there, this one was particularly objectionable because he was a pro-Nazi. His friends were Hitler and Himmler on a personal basis. He made trips over there to see him. He was strongly supportive of him. He threatened Baldwin with abdication when Baldwin was thinking about doing a few anti-German things during the early parts of 1936. So this was a situation, somehow they had to figure out how to get rid of, the Russians had to figure out how to get rid of this guy without, if it was possible. Well, it turns out that it was possible, and the reason that it was possible is because the prince, David, had, as a youth, become infatuated with this American woman named Wallis Simpson. Now, Wallis Simpson came from Baltimore, but she had a long and speckled history as a high-class prostitute in China. By high class, I mean the kind of woman that you see portrayed from time to time in certain movies about life as it was in Shanghai. At any rate, while she was there, she got to know the prince, and that was the end of him because she quickly found out how to bring him under control. What he didn't know was that Wallis Simpson was one of those women who the Red Army intelligence, the GRU, what we would call in the U.S. G2, had recruited her as one of those foreigners that spoke English that they wanted to have on board when they were there in force. You know, recall the Red Army was enforcing China from until 1927. So in that period they had recruited her and they'd brought her on board. So Stalin gave orders to the appropriate people, and I discussed this on page 351 of your textbook. And now he gave orders to Beria, who is the man he's picked to handle this particular problem, pulling him out of Georgia and giving him this particular job, to see to it, if at all possible, that this woman now gets the king to abdicate. And he thinks this will work because Baldwin hates this guy. Man, Baldwin represents the majority of the British capitalist class. Baldwin doesn't want anything to do with this king because he considers him too reactionary, and he certainly doesn't want to have a king that is going to constantly be putting him in a position of trying to make an alliance with Hitler, who, so far, Baldwin has completely rejected the idea of putting Hitler in charge of this campaign against the Soviet Union. And Stalin certainly doesn't want that to change because of this new guy on the throne. So the idea is to get this woman to get the king to abdicate. Now, did that work? Well, I think it worked. I mean, different people might give other reasons, but I think that's the reason why by the end of the year Edward VIII did abdicate, and he used the excuse that Baldwin was trying to force him to make a choice between the woman he loved and staying on as king, so he would go with her. So he left England, never came back, as a matter of fact, and then for the rest of his life he was living somewhere else. At first it was in France, and eventually he ended up in the Bahamas. Interestingly, J. Edgar Hoover wanted him interned in the Bahamas and put into prison, but FDR decided that he would go along with what Churchill wanted to do, which was, Churchill didn't want the disgrace of having a king in prison because he'd been a traitor. So he had decided, as this king eventually would flee to fascist Spain and fascist Portugal, and he had decided that rather than intern him there for desertion and treason, that he would let him go and be governor of the Bahamas. So now, to David, that was a hell of a step down, but to the Americans, especially J. Edgar Hoover, this was a terrible thing, that the guy should be in prison. Well, he didn't get in prison, and we could leave this story here as far as that goes. But that was one of the problems that Stalin had to confront before he decides to get involved in the Spanish Civil War. So, by the time that he gets involved in sending all of these troops undercover and all of these internationalist fighters with Soviet arms, these problems have been cleared up. But as you can see, this was a mess that you're stepping into. Now, the fascist revolt started on July 17th, 1936, and that is exactly when Orlov is sent back to, on August 2nd, Stalin decided to send Orlov back to Spain to take over the actual direction of the armed struggle. That happens, and then we go into the battles for Madrid, which I described to you. They got stalled around Madrid. There were some very famous confrontations between the fascists and the Republicans in a variety of places that I visited over half a century ago when I was in Spain. I was there when Franco was still dictator, and but they were defeated in the spring of 1937. Now, as 1937 goes together, March and Franco are together forever now, and March is helping Franco bring the other fascist elements around the country politically under his wing, and they get all of that done. Now Franco has March has put up 1.2 billion US dollars in gold into an Italian bank at this time. Now that obviously didn't go over there to get a few airplanes. That's what he had to pay the Mussolini gang for those 150,000 troops. He also got a 20 Ju-52 transport planes from the Hitlerites, as well as a few things from the matter in Italy. Now, besides the troops, I mean, you remember that when we were talking Kirov and when we were talking about Zinoviev and Kamenev betraying the revolution on the eve of the revolution in 1917, I mentioned that the time would come. Not everybody forgot about this betrayal, even though Lenin had been willing to take them back into the party. And you know, there were conditions attached to that at the time, like they were supposed to have non-voting status. But as I've studied the records for 1918, 1919, 1920, it looks to me like they were voting anyway, even though that was they're technically not supposed to be doing that. But so they had gotten they had reason to think that all of this betrayal of theirs was buried and forgotten, but it wasn't. Now, when a Communist Party leader and boss for Leningrad named Kirov had been assassinated in 1934, the investigation turned up Zinoviev and Kamenev as two of those who were being held responsible for it. I won't go into the details of that case, but they did confess at trial in 1936, and they were shot by the end of the summer. So that was another thing that had to be gotten out of the way. During July and August of 1936, Hitler's transports made 461 flights, transferring 7,350 troops from Spanish Morocco to neighboring Spain. And into Spain in September, 324 more Nazi flights lifted another 5,500 troops. So the rest of fascist troops from North Africa came on ships. Now, Hitler sent 50,000 German troops to help Franco, as I think I mentioned. Mussolini had 150,000 Italian troops. Dr. Salazar from Portugal sent 20,000 troops. The fascist bloc together sent the Spanish fascist army 1,150 tanks, 1,650 warplanes, and 2,700 artillery pieces. Stalin matched all of that in shipments that were coming to Barcelona, and he matched the troop situation as well as they could with volunteers from these international brigades. The first group of volunteers that got there were Russians, and there were a couple of thousand of them that got there in September, or October 12th, I guess, to be precise, of 1936. But by 1947, Stalin had sent them 648 planes, 407 tanks, 60 armored cars, 1,900 artillery pieces, 21,000 machine guns, 500,000 rifles. And to instruct them and use them, he'd sent along specialist commanders, which included, these are Army officers, of course, from the Red Army. There were 2,100 of them, including 772 pilots, 350 tank commanders, 100 artillerymen, 222 general advisors, and 204 interpreters. So, and for the next 3 years, Stalin's going to keep pouring large numbers of material in there. One of the advantages that the Republicans had is they had money. They had a gold reserve. Now, some of that gold they had used before the Russians started sending their equipment to buy equipment in France. But other than that, the gold was available. Now, Stalin wanted that gold in Russia to protect it from seizure by the Nazis, and also as guarantee for payment for all of this equipment that he was sending. Now, as he told Orlov before he left, if they didn't have any money, we would of course foot the bill. But they have the money. So in this case, they have about 788 tons, as it turned out, of gold. And if we bring that over here, that would be security against all this weaponry we're sending them and the costs involved, and it would also be very helpful for the development of our own 5-year plan. So this is another reason for us to get involved in this civil war in Spain. So, just take a look at what the Americans did on their own. In April and May, the International Brigades led a Spanish army an assault against the fascists and Italians. So that was an attack against about 250,000 men. The Soviet Air Force destroyed the advance guard of German aircraft, and therefore they negated that weapon that the fascists had on their side. In the battle for Madrid, all told, in the fighting for Madrid, I should say, from October of 1936 through February 1937, our brigades lost about 20,000 men. Now, that is of a total of about 60,000 that we sent during the course of the entire war. That's when we lost the most, but it did work. Now, among those 60,000 internationalists, there were 3,600 U.S. males, white and black, mostly white, but some black also. And there were 80 women in the consolidated unit that included Marion Merriam, the wife of the U.S. Communist Major Robert Merriam, who was leading the brigade, their first combat commander. He was a friend of Ernest Hemingway's, a personal friend, and when Hemingway wrote the book For Whom the Bell Tolls, for those of you who remember it or have read it or saw the movie, he's the one that Hemingway based his character Robert Jordan on. Real name was Robert Merriman. At any rate, there is today the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives in New York University, and it's online and you can do research there. Now, some of these fighters got there early because they somehow or another they managed to get there. Perhaps they were already in Europe someplace. All they had to do was climb across the Pyrenees Mountains. I say all they had to do because those are not, that's not an easy climb, but I mean, if you did get across the Pyrenees Mountains, then you could probably find yourself to a Republican base area. There's a movie called Into the Fire, American Women in the Spanish Civil War, by an American filmmaker made in 2002 named Julia Newman. It's on Netflix, that you can watch that if you like. Now, there were others that became famous there. One is the Canadian doctor Norman Bethune, who started out here in Spain, and then he went to China, where he helped the Chinese, and in China today he is a household name, but it's a sad fact that here in North America, I would venture to say that very few people have ever heard of him. But at any rate, he started out as a doctor in Spain. He invented the method of taking blood transfusion equipment to the battlefield rather than having to haul these poor soldiers that were shot up back to a field hospital. And you know, under best of circumstances, that's a time-consuming trip. But you can imagine what these Spanish roads were like. So you were losing a lot more people in transit to the hospital than you were if you could bring this equipment to them on the front line. So Bethune invented that technique, and he used it. This is also a good time to take a look at one of the next commanders of the American Lincoln, of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. By the way, that brigade started out as an international brigade composed of 2 battalions, the George Washington Battalion and the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. But in the early fighting for Madrid, the George Washington Battalion was wiped out, and therefore those that were, the few that remained from it, were consolidated into the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, and it pretty soon in the international press it began to be called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, by the name that it retains to this very day. There's another show on Netflix called The Good Fight, which is a Spanish Civil War documentary where you can see this next commander named Steve Nelson. There aren't very many photographs of Steve Nelson, let alone movies about him. So for those of you that have any real interest in the history of communism in this country or in Spain in those years, I would recommend that you watch that, because Steve Nelson became important later, not just because he'd been a battalion commander, but because he was one of those who took on Wisconsin's Joe McCarthy early on. And if you read this book of mine carefully, you're going to see that, according to me anyway, Steve Nelson was the man who was the Soviet agent, illegal chief of espionage in Los Alamos. And we know who the legal chief was. It was the head of the Soviet office out of New York City. But at any rate, I'm not going to get off into that subject, but just tell you that Steve Nelson emerges at this time, and many people that know this war in detail have said he was the best commander the Abraham Lincoln Brigade ever had. However that may be, one of the things for sure is that 1937 turned out to be a really critical year. Now, by the end of 1937, Kim Philby was reporting from Madrid, attached to the Phalangist side of the war. Now, Kim Philby is going to be the chief Soviet spy in Great Britain in the not-too-distant future. So this is the way he's building up his credentials on the fascist right, so that he can get recruited into MI6 when the time comes. By the way, the real name of the chief of MI6 is C, not M. But in this book, I explain that, but then point out that since Ian Fleming has made M famous worldwide for the chief of MI6, I've frequently used that also. Now, one of the things that you're going to read about if you read this Molotov Remembers, his autobiography, is the organization called SMERSH, S-M-E-R-S-H. Those of you who are spy fiction aficionados may remember that SMERSH was one of James Bond's main enemies at a certain time in his early career. But at any rate, there really was an organization called SMERSH. These are the Russian initials for Death to Spies, Smert Spionem. Now, this is important because SMERSH was a key operator for Soviet intelligence inside Spain. And at different times it had different jobs, but one of its jobs was to send information from Kim Philby when it was necessary to Moscow Center. That wouldn't be necessary very often because he wasn't there for an intelligence mission, or at least this is the idea. But what happened was that on New Year's Eve, I believe it was, of 1937, the last day of the year, while Philby and several other correspondents were on their way to the battlefront, a Soviet rocket hit their car and killed everybody in it except for Philby, who walked away unscathed. So he made some good press for the Franco forces over that matter, and a few weeks later he was awarded Franco's highest honor, the Order of the Red Courage, for the nice things he'd said about Franco and the way he'd handled the entire incident. So those were the kinds of things when his communication system with Moscow would be useful. At any rate, I only mention that because it's one of those things that happened during 1937, which had ramifications. I also mentioned in this book another SMERSH agent that I came to know named Anita Boyer, but I'm not going to go through all of that. You can read it on page 362 if you're interested. Now, Stalin took direct command of this situation in Spain in 1937 because he didn't have any choice, and the situation was so tricky that he really needed to run it personally. Now, espionage front that the Soviet Union is running is just as important as the military front, because changes in the position of the British and French with regard to Hitler will be reflected in Spain. and vice versa. Changes that are occurring militarily within Spain are going to be reflected in the positions of these powers. So there are certain kinds of get-togethers, social get-togethers, that are important to have a voice in sight of. I go through one that was held on April 23rd, 1937. Now this is right at the time that the fascist drive on Madrid has been permanently blunted. And so you can imagine that Stalin was really interested in what was going on behind the scenes in the fascist headquarters. And here he was able to insert Kim Philby into a dinner which featured Gloria von Furstenberg, a courtesan, they say, highly desired by the fascist perverse, at her villa outside the Phalangist temporary front headquarters city of Saragossa. And I'm going to go through all of that because there she met, in the book, and there she met Heinrich Himmler, and they had a very interesting conversation with Philby, and what came out of that was that Philby, for the first time, realized that Himmler was already in discussions with the British over betraying Hitler. Now that was information that had to get back to Stalin like immediately. So it meant that Philby had to sober up, and he had to get to his secret radio, and he had to make this connection, and he had to do it that night, and he did. So that's the kind of so Stalin knew about things that were developing secretly between the so-called allies and different elements within Germany as fast as they were happening, literally. Now the Spanish gold, which we started talking about a minute ago here, was taken, 788 tons of it were taken under Soviet ships by Alexander Orlov, who moved it straight to Odessa. And from there, special trains were brought, of course, with specially loyal troops to carry all of that gold to Moscow. Now, 788 tons of gold is a lot of money, so especially in those days. So on top of the fact that Russia already has all of the agricultural produce as its government property, it's now got a pretty nice addition to its own gold supply. Whatever they still had on hand that they had inherited from the Tsars. So that was another good reason for these guys to be working in Spain. So that wasn't all just politics. Now the problem was that Baldwin is going to get frightened by what's happening, by the Soviet successes in Spain. So by the end of 1937, he's decided, oh shit, I guess I'm going to have to go with this crackpot, nutball, poor white trash, Hitler, whether I like it or not. And of course he's got a lot of people telling him, oh, Hitler's not that bad, you know. Once you get used to his table manners or his flatulence, you can handle him. And so that's a situation which is developing with it, and he does. What happens is, by the end of 1937, Baldwin sends Halifax to see Hitler, and they make a deal. And the essential part of it is that Hitler will lead this de facto London, Berlin, Rome axis against the Soviet Union as soon as he can. But first he's got to finish up matters in Spain, and then they can worry about what happens in Eastern Europe. And Halifax says, yeah, we're not going to have any objections. You know, we've said what we have to say about the Jewish question, and we won't be agreeing on that, but we're willing to overlook it. So that's how the Baldwin gang finally came to peace with the Hitler gang. Now, that's why we also say that the war starts, the First World War starts in Spain. Now, how did it actually conclude? Well, what happened was that the Germans and Italians stepped up their aid to the Franco forces, and the British and French continued to do everything they could to isolate the Republican government from any kind of ability to buy arms or engage in trade with the outside world. This was part of their so-called neutrality policy. But it was a neutrality which clearly favored those that intervened, which in this case were mainly the Germans. So the Germans managed to force the situation, and in 1939, you may recall that well, actually, the end of 1938, Chamberlain pretty well signed away Czechoslovakia and the rest of Eastern Europe to Hitler. That was the final signal to him that he could go all the way. The Spanish Republican government decided that they would be better off without Soviet help, and they decided to throw themselves on the mercy of the British and French, and that was the end of them. So as soon as they made that decision, which was simultaneously with Chamberlain giving away Czechoslovakia, Stalin decided to withdraw the international brigades, and 6 weeks later they were gone. They made a final march through Barcelona and took off, and that was the end of that. Stalin continued to send military equipment to the Republican Army, but the British and French began to intern it before it could ever get to Spain. So, despite that fact, so the forces of the West conspired to give Hitler not just Czechoslovakia, but also Spain. And it paid off for the Hitlerites in the sense that Spain joined the anti-Comintern alliance, which up until that time was Italy, Germany, and Japan. Now it was Italy, Germany, Japan, and Spain. They would attack the Soviet Union, or three of them would at any rate, in June of 1941. So as this war drew to a close in 1938 for us, it was finally finished by April 1939. We were only a few months away from the beginning of the German assault on Poland. So that was a war which Stalin was trying to delay from getting to the Soviet Union, jockeying the best he could on his frontiers. Moldova was forced out of Romania. The Bulgarians were forced to make certain kinds of concessions, as was Finland and Romania. The Red Army was moving attack forces closer and closer to its western frontier in a hope of deflecting Hitler. Stalin desperately needed at least another year to finish tank manufacture. I think I mentioned to you before, the T-34s we only had a handful of by the time the Nazis attacked, but if we'd had another year, we would have had 10,000. So we're finally getting to the point where no matter what we do, the Hitlerites are going to attack us for their own internal reasons, and there's not much we can do about it, except be prepared to absorb the attack unless we launch one first. And to launch one first has its own ramifications, not the least of which is that this would give the excuse to the other capitalist countries to come in and support Germany against Russia. So this is how this thing is boiling out. That's going to be the end of this particular tape, because I just want to take you through these events that led up to the attack on the Soviet Union, which brings us into World War II.